Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a talk from the Berkeley Institute of Jewish Law and Israel Studies on the topic of Israel-China relations. As the audience is slowly growing, I will wait a few seconds before I invite my co-host, Professor Ehud, to join us and tell you a little about the Institute and tell you a little about this speaker series. So my name is Ron Hassner. I'm the Helen Diller Family Chair in Israel Studies and a faculty director at the Berkeley Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies, which is based here on the UC Berkeley campus, which you see virtually behind me. The idea for this series came through conversations that we've had, both the faculty and staff at the Institute, about the changing role of the United States in the Middle East. There was, I think, a clear impression in these conversations that over the last decade or so, the role of the United States in the Middle East has shrunk to some extent, and the ability of the United States to influence world events, and in fact, the desire of the United States to influence world events has also shifted somewhat and perhaps shrunk as well. And so in that context, Israel is looking around the world and considering what other options are available in terms of great power sponsors. The US-Israel relationship is relatively young, even though the United States was a supporter of the young state of Israel from the get-go. It was really only a reliable ally starting in the 70s. Even in the 1960s, there were significant tensions between Israel and the United States, and its sponsors to that point were primarily the USSR and France. So this is a relatively young alliance, and we know from the study of international politics that alliances don't last forever, or to quote a 19th century British Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, states have no permanent friends or permanent allies. States only have permanent interests. So it is in that context that we have decided to launch a series of conversations about Israel and its next great relationship, perhaps supplementing the US-Israel relationship, or perhaps gradually over time replacing it the way it replaced its relationship with France and the Soviet Union. Hard to imagine, I know, but who knows what the future may bring. The news is full of surprises. So today we will focus on Israel's relationship with China. Future conversations will be about Israel's relationship with India, Israel's relationship with Russia, and we'll see how far that series takes us. Before I invite Professor Ron to join, I wanted to let you know that the Berkeley Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies, which I am a co-director of and which is hosting this talk today, engages and empowers UC Berkeley students and faculty. Our goal is to transform the landscape for the study of Israel and the study of Jewish law, thought, and identity through an innovative model of teaching, programming, and mentorship. And we are supported in that endeavor by generous philanthropy from both foundations and individuals, many of whom are joining us in conversation today. So I'd like to invite to please join me on the screen Professor Eiran of Haifa University. He's a visiting professor at our institute this fall to explore together Israel's new alliance with China and what it might mean for geopolitics as we know it. Hi, Udi, how are you?
Ron, thank you for the invitation.
So Eiran is an associate professor, formally Ehud Eiran, but we're being informal, is an associate professor of international relations at Haifa University. His research focuses on conflict resolution, governance, and policy in both Israel and the Middle East. Right now, he is a visiting scholar in political science at Stanford University, and as I mentioned, an Israel Institute visiting faculty at our university affiliated with the Berkeley Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies. And in fact, right now, he is teaching a wonderful class titled Israel's Security and Foreign Relations to a group of 60-odd Berkeley undergraduates. Udi, before we start talking, let me just let people know that there are well over 100 people joining us in this conversation. So it's sort of impossible under these conditions to have everybody raise their hand and shout out questions. Dear audience members, at the bottom of your screen, you will find a button entitled Q&A. And if you type your questions starting now into that Q&A, you will not receive an immediate response, but we will sort of collate and collect your questions, and then in about half an hour from now, I will start asking the questions on your behalf. So thank you again, Udi, for joining. Here's my first question for you. Could you please, to those of us who are not super well informed about Israel-China relations, give us a very brief background about events from 1948 until today on the Israel-China front?
So even before 48, there's some reminiscences of interactions between Jews and Chinese that had effect on Israel. As you may know, there was a big Jewish-Russian community in China. Prime Minister Ehud Olmert's grandfather, in fact, was part of this community and is buried in China. Similarly, there were a few Jews who were involved in the revolution. Some of them ended up in Israel. One of them, Jacob Rosenfeld, is buried in Tel Aviv, and once a year, the Chinese embassy in Tel Aviv shows up at his graveyard and focuses on that context. So these are not major effects on Israeli history, but it's important to highlight them. In 1948, Israel was actually the first, 1949, Israel was the first country in the Middle East to recognize the People's Republic of China. As you may recall, most Arab countries were pro-Western, monarchic, were further away from the socialist ideas of Mao Zedong. However, this positive Israeli approach was not translated to full diplomatic relations. And by the mid-50s, as Israel aligned itself more with the West and China was more on the cutting edge of revolutions, in the next 2 decades, if you will, the Chinese supported wholeheartedly Israel's foes, including training PLO operatives in China, supplying weapons, and so on. The 70s saw a change in China, as we know, openness under Deng Xiaoping, and part of this openness included secret cooperation with Israel, probably also in security arena. This was translated to the next phase of the relationship in 1992. The two countries, or a bit earlier, 1992, they opened embassies and they moved to normal relations.
Why in 1992?
It's a combination. Israel launched into the peace process, so it was more legitimate. And also there were internal Chinese, after Tiananmen, China sought as much as it could international legitimacy. So there was a meeting there of minds. The story is slightly more nuanced because Israel had a consulate in Hong Kong that was allowed to remain. There were talks in the 80s about leaving it even when China becomes the sovereign. In the last few years, China emerged as the second largest economic partner Israel has in terms of imports and exports.
And is that, so this change that you've talked about just now, is that the most important in your mind, important change in the Israel-China relationship? Is it all about economics?
It's mostly economics. For now, Israel is obviously closely aligned with the United States, and also we are not China's main interest in the region. So it's largely economic. There was some military cooperation, but essentially under American pressure in 2000 and 2005, basically America asked us to stop supporting China militarily, and Israel had to rescind the deal we signed with China and paid a huge fine, $350 million to China for canceling that deal.
What was the deal? What was this a deal for?
It was for the Falcon plane. That's a Russian plane we bought and retrofitted. We disregarded American warnings. I was a junior member of Prime Minister's team, and I was in some of the meetings. And in a very dramatic event, the night Prime Minister Barak flew to Camp David and really needed President Clinton, we drafted a letter, and the next morning someone went to China and had to explain to them that we're a small country, they're bigger powers.
Okay, but am I wrong to be under the impression that in recent months and years, there's been a sort of warming up of this relationship and a closening of ranks between Israel and China, almost in a way that worries the United States?
There was a getting closer. It was mostly on the economic arena. There's a bit more beyond that. For example, the IDF Staff College for its yearly tour went to China last year, although also to the United States. What happened is, I think the latter of what you said, America got more and more annoyed. This is part of a broader policy of the Trump administration. And so we began facing more serious American pressure over mostly economic investments. Israel's Haifa port, portion of it is being built and is to be operated by a Chinese company. And there's direct pressure from the US not to move forward on this deal. So it's mostly in the context, the tensions or the issue is highlighted because of the American approach rather than anything in Israeli-Chinese relations.
Interesting. And the American opposition to this is just a concern that this will somehow strengthen China, or a more forward-thinking concern that developing the port of Haifa, or Chinese, I believe, are also heavily invested in the subway system in Tel Aviv, that this will give China a foothold of some sort.
So, this more assertive approach of the Trump administration is relatively recent, and it's not organized in any containment type document. But what it seems is it's first of all preventing China to access technology or have footholds in technology. So under American pressure, Israel built an entity that supervises deals mostly in the technological arena, a bit like CFIUS to those who follow the American arena. Ports specifically are an issue of concern because the port of Haifa is also a port of the Sixth Fleet, which had dwindled. That's the American fleet that operates in the Middle East, dwindled in the last few years, but still it's symbolic. And I think it's sort of a general approach of a sort of not fully developed containment. If China is interested, we should try and stop that.
This is unique to Trump, or is some of this a leftover? I mean, you talked about Clinton under Bush, under Obama.
It's this type of pressure is recent. It's not even from the early days of the Trump administration. It's really fairly recent. The pressures earlier by all administrations were over security and military issues. But this type of pressure on Chinese economic activity in Israel is really a phenomenon of the last few months. So this seminar came at the height of these issues.
Not by coincidence. So from the Chinese point of view, what are Chinese goals? I mean, obviously, you build a port, you invest in, the tunnels in Haifa, if I remember correctly, were constructed by Chinese crews. The subway system in Tel Aviv is a vast production. There's also Chinese involvement in power plants and desalination plants, solar energy. So obviously economics is a big motivator here for the Chinese. Could you talk more broadly about the sort of grand strategy of China in the Middle East, other than financial benefit?
So they have interests that are further away from us. First and foremost, supply of energy, which means they'll always be very close to Iran because they need Iranian oil and their economy runs on these supplies. That already puts us in a place that's somewhat less significant. Specifically in Israel, the interest is one of their visions, as many of us know, is this Belt and Road Initiative. That would be a track that goes on land and on sea from China to Europe. It gets close to Israel in the Suez Canal, but at least since 2012, there's an idea to do a sub-route of that will go from the Red Sea, from the Israeli port of Eilat, in a train track to the Mediterranean. So in a way, this, more philosophically, that resurrects Israel's role as a crossover between continents. So that would be the second interest. The third interest is simply investments of Chinese companies. We had, for example, I think in 2018, about 15% of funds that went into venture capital in Israel were from China. But from a Chinese perspective, Israel is a market, but not a very big one.
And in Israel's neighborhood, how are the Chinese balancing their relationship with, I guess, the most important players in the region? So that would be Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. I'm asking you easy questions, by the way. I hope you know. These are all softballs. The hard ones are coming later from the audience.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very good question. For now, they're not called to take any sides. Their approach is we talk to everyone, and our engagement is mostly economic. In a conference they had last year called the Asian Dialogue for Civilizations, they highlighted that their interaction with world actors is of mutual benefit, is only economic, does not include political aspects, and therefore they don't see themselves as intervening in internal policies or between countries. At least for now, that's the way they're presenting it. The second mechanism by which they avoid engaging potential tensions is sticking to international legitimacy. So their approach in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is whatever the UN says or what's general international legitimacy, we'll follow that. We do know from history that countries, great power as they rise, shape more sharper preferences, and we may see that in the Middle East. For now, they're sticking to these more moderate, cautious approaches.
That's actually very interesting, because if you think about the early stages of great power involvement in the Arab-Israeli conflict, in the very early stages, 1948, early Cold War, and the United States and the Soviet Union haven't quite figured out yet whose side they're on, and who's going to be with me and who's going to be against me.
Yeah.
And so what I'm learning from your answer is that the first step is just pragmatism.
Yeah. It's highly, highly pragmatic. In another event, I had the chance to participate in China in 2017. It turned out they had a big cadre of people in the foreign ministry who had long engaged in the region and were clearly more on the Arab side, but being highly pragmatic. They also said Israel is a technological giant, it's powerful. In other words, we have the history, memory, and preferences, but we're also very pragmatic.
Is this the event you brought us a photo from?
Yes, thank you.
What's that photo
called?
It
was photo number 1. I don't know if you can bring it up.
Yeah.
So in 2017, the Chinese foreign minister convened a 3-day, they called it Israeli-Palestinian Seminar. They brought senior Palestinian leaders and the deputy speaker of the Israeli Knesset and a small Israeli delegation, which I represented, I guess, the academic hat, which was fascinating to see how they approached the Israeli-Palestinian issue, even stylistically. I've been to similar events. This is myself. The gentleman in the center is the Chinese foreign minister, and on the left is my colleague Nimrod Goren from Mitvim Institute. We spent 2 days in this big hall. It's in the Great Hall of the People in Tiananmen Square. So both us and the Palestinians realized who were the big players here. You walk halls of red carpets. And unlike events in Europe and the US, the focus was not about us interacting with the Palestinians, but rather quite rigid control by the Chinese hosts. This is dramatically different from ideas like Oslo. Let's send the Israelis and Palestinians to bond. It was exactly the opposite.
And what's the Chinese purpose behind inviting you? I assume paying for your accommodations, large buffets, and Palestinian counterparts. What's the message?
I think the message, as we see in other fronts of Chinese behavior, responsible great powers that rise should show global interest in global problems. Perhaps a more direct interest is if they are to use the Middle East as a route, as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, it should be stable. But part of it, in my view, was, maybe because I'm a critical academic, was performance politics. It's more signaling. But they put a huge effort. The foreign minister spent numerous hours on this. It was major headlines in the Chinese TV. It wasn't such a huge event, but for them, it was more the signaling and the performance. For example, the details of what we'll do with the Palestinians were never fully clarified. It was like, make peace, do something, not anything more specific.
I see. So was there any yield from the conversations there? Or, I mean, it must have been, given how intelligent the people involved were on both the Israeli and Palestinian side, it must have been clear to them that they are participating in a Chinese performance rather than actually negotiating.
True, although there was a push to issue a final declaration, which was done. It happened on the same day that the US declared that it's moving the embassy to Washington, the American embassy to Jerusalem. So the Palestinians were very edgy and they refused a lot of the Chinese pressure. But there was a very general declaration about the significance of talking to each other and including other actors and so on.
Are the Chinese making any effort to signal a sort of cultural warmth towards Israel, trying to, provide space for a Jewish community in China, or do other forms of sort of cultural exchange, or is it really just about trade and infrastructure?
No, so the Chinese, again, it was surprising and perhaps contrary to the image many of us have that it's about trade. There are efforts to include cultural components. The Chinese opened cultural institutions in Israel. They're encouraging Israelis to take exams at the A level. It's like the final high school exam, the Bagut. They're now, it's small numbers, but they're about, last year, 50 kids in Israel took their A levels in Chinese.
Wow.
And if you see some of the Chinese formal responses to the American pressure on economic issues, they bring up cultural themes. For example, their ambassador wrote a letter saying the American accusations about the Wuhan virus, you Jews should know about it because you too were accused in the past in other issues. So there is cultural awareness, and it's, at least in some events like this Asian Dialogue of Civilization, it also came with a packet of what worldview they have and what cultural role is there for other countries.
Interesting. Okay, so now here's the elephant in the room. The sort of issue that we've been dancing around is Israel trying to thread this needle between the United States, which certainly was and remains its most influential great power ally, and I think it's fair to say that whatever special relationship existed is still going strong, but the future with the United States is uncertain, and this tension with China. So how is Israel trying to navigate this minefield?
So for now, there's awareness of it. And there was, I think Israel's, if I'm not mistaken, Israel's second biggest embassy after Washington is in Beijing. And we have many consulates in China, a bit like we have in the US. But I think at least the current leadership sees the US as an irreplaceable ally. For many reasons. Half of the Jewish people live in the US. Israel is also the state of the Jewish people. The system of government in America allows Israelis to express more directly to American leadership their preferences. And in terms of raw power, the US is still a leading global power. So there is an awareness that we may have to navigate in a more sophisticated way. And for now, Prime Minister Netanyahu is handling it quite well by stressing that the relationship with China is economic and with the US is a strategic alliance. But even if I look 5 or 10 years forward, I don't see Israel, moving to the Chinese side. That's my own opinion.
Okay, that's your opinion, but are there hints that there are some in the Israeli government who are contemplating an option in which China is the number one preference to maybe come close second after the United States versus Russia, for example, or India?
At least in the current elites, I don't think so. Partly, you have to think of the sociological makeup of Israel's current leadership. Prime Minister Netanyahu, educated at MIT, former American citizen. His main competitor on the right, Naftali Bennett, former US citizen, parents emigrated from the US, had an American company. So just the top military leadership goes to train in the US. If you do look closer, there are two seams or two areas where other voices may come. First of all, Israel's economic establishment is much more open to the relationship. So you could see a tension that you see in other peripheral countries in the periphery between the foreign and security establishment that is closely aligned with the US and the economic establishment in Israel, for example, the shipping authority. They are open to negotiate, to have a closer relationship with China. And also China made some effort to reach out to younger people. They did some training programs, for example, for parliamentary assistants in the Knesset. So these are people who in 25 years would be in leadership positions, but they're still very new in this field. The US has the whole Cold War training people in the context of global competition. In China, it's still done in a somewhat heavy way. It's not fully authentic in the American sense of similar programs.
So that's interesting. So that's really the last set of questions I want to ask you myself before I open the floor to questions from students, faculty members, community members, and the many friends of our institute. So to what extent do you see sort of cultural barriers in an Israeli-Chinese rapprochement? Questions of value, priority, ethics. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so in the late 90s or mid 90s, I heard Yecheskel Dor was one of Israel's big strategic thinkers. He's a professor now in his 90s. And already in 1995, he said, China will rise, but there's a huge cultural obstacle. And that is that our alliance with the West, with Britain and then with the US, draws on this Judeo-Christian tradition. all these towns in America that are called Sharon and Bethlehem, and the New Testament. And the East is very different. It doesn't have all the biases, but also all the love, perhaps, that some sectors in the US have. So that's perhaps one component. The second component, as I said, Israeli elites have a strong, long relationship with the West, with the United States. This may change, assuming China will also rise in the cultural realm. You know, it's becoming now the biggest film market in the world. That means there are going to be more Chinese films. So long term, you know, at least theoretically, it is of course possible that there will be more cultural influence and more affinity. And also,
Great.
Yeah, go ahead.
Fantastic. So while we're talking, the 140 so members of our audience have been bombarding us with questions, and my colleagues at the Institute have been nice enough to help me organize these a little. So Udi, a question that was predictable and has come up very often, including from one of our undergraduate fellows, Amir Grunhaus, who works very closely with us. Talk a little about how the Palestinian issue actually, not just in performance, but actually plays into the China-Israel relation?
It's, first of all, wonderful to start with the student questions, and I welcome our students from the course we teach together. I know a large number of them are here, so welcome and thank you. My impression now, it's not a huge issue. It has been historically a big issue. It maybe manifests itself in UN votes, but on a day-to-day reality, as I stressed earlier, my sense is that the Chinese are very pragmatic. And since Israel is the strongest actor with the access to technology that maybe is of interest to the Chinese, it won't be a major issue.
Does it, do you think it might affect, as China thinks about tightening relationships with Iran, which I'll ask you about in a second, or with Saudi Arabia, that China feels it needs to take a stance in order to improve those relations?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I think we are now at the moment in Chinese foreign policy that they feel very self-confident, to be very assertive and to take positions even if their future allies won't be so happy with it. We are the big elephant in this Euro-Asian landmass, and we will handle it in our own interests. Again, we don't have a full picture. You know, China, unlike the US, doesn't offer a lot of white papers of exactly what they want. And it's not even clear, I think, to some analysts where exactly is foreign policy made. Is it in the party or in the foreign ministry? But for now, in fact, they pride themselves of being able to engage with everyone without taking too much of deep stances. This against the background of strong support of the Palestinian issue.
Great. So here's a question that comes from a faculty member and a close friend of the Institute, colleague of mine, George Breslauer. He's asking about recent China-Iran cooperation and to what extent it is at odds with Israel's efforts to improve relations with China and the Trump administration's agenda.
Look, in the short term, in terms of the Israeli-Chinese alliance, it's not a huge issue, but it does raise the concern, and some Israeli security analysts brought this option. If China does evolve in a clearer way into leading an anti-American bloc and supporting anti-American actors like Iran, this may long-term compromise Israeli interests. You know, Chinese companies own some significant Israeli corporations, have access to important resources. So it is a potential risk on the horizon, but not an immediate risk. Another issue which I know people in the US are thinking about is also China's technological advancement. As you know, Israel partly is so effective because it enjoys access to American technology, especially in arms, and US commitment to a qualitative edge. We may move to a world in which Chinese technology is more advanced and they are not committed to a qualitative edge. So that may be a risk. It will take a while, at least.
Explain, you just said something very important. Explain qualitative edge for those of us who are a little behind.
Okay, so under congressional legislation, but also as a matter of practice, at least from the 80s, possibly from the 70s, the US has committed to, when it sells arms in the Middle East, to make sure Israel remains more powerful. It gets access to more advanced technologies. It needs, to the point that Congress sometimes needs a wink from Israel to approve the sale of some arms to Arab countries. Even arms sales under Reagan included some limitations on the use of arms and basing them. The F-15s that were sold to Saudi Arabia in the 80s could not be based in the airbase that's closest to Israel, Tabuk. So that's a huge, one of the reasons Israel is so effective in its security challenges in the region is this American commitment, because America is the leading arms developer and supplier in the world. But we may be moving to a world within a decade or so in which China will become the leading technological supplier of weapons. And that may challenge Israel, including for the first time I saw people in professional journals writing, maybe you should think of fighting from technological inferiority, not the superiority we're enjoying now.
Explain this. Israel should consider?
Yes. Israel, as you may know, Israel, at least from the early 90s, is technologically more advanced than all of its immediate neighbors in terms of weaponry, intelligence, use of cyber. So we operate in an arena in which we are technologically superior to our neighbors, broadly speaking. However, if we move to a world in which China develops the best weapons and then sells them to our foes, we may start thinking, how do you operate in a world which you're not technologically superior? That doesn't mean you're going to lose, by the way.
Yes.
Sometimes the technologically inferior win, but it's a change of mindset that we may have to do. Again, this is not immediate.
Very interesting. One of our Institute fellows, Maya Rosen, is online to ask you a question. I'm going to let her ask that question herself. Maya, are you around?
Hi. So my question is, so in the Cold War, Israel was kind of stuck between the USSR and the US. And now there seems to be a Cold War brewing between the US and China. So is there any precedence from the Cold War on how Israel will act in terms of foreign policy?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Thank you, Maya.
History, thank you, Maya. It's of course a great guide. I think it's somewhat different. First of all, the competition between the USSR and the USA, even in Israel, had an ideological component. In other words, there are Israelis who felt the Soviet way of life is superior to Western capitalism. This is not the case here. I think Israeli elites, at least, are much closer to the American liberal model than an authoritarian Chinese model. The second thing is the passage of time. Whereas you're absolutely right that in 1950, Israel had limited support from any allies, and by miracle was able to get both the US and the USSR to vote for it in the UN General Assembly. But generally, these were two faraway powers. None of them was very close to Israel. We are now after close to 50 years. It's true, as Ron said, this is a young alliance, but it is rather deep. So whatever conversation we're having about choosing two allies, this, what we call in the jargon of social science, path dependency, plays an important role. Even the fact that we all come to sabbaticals and teach in Berkeley and not in Haifa University, that has an effect over time.
Yes, absolutely. Weather especially is a big factor.
And the air.
Yeah, the wonderful air quality. Jim Gilbert, who is listening in, wonders if you could tell us a little about the relationship of some of Israel's neighbors to China. Does Israel have a particularly close relationship compared to, say, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, or are they all competing for China's attention?
So as it's driven now in economics, by mostly economic factors, I think a lot of the relationship are with other neighboring countries. First of all, they're not competitive. If something, they're cumulative. Because if the Chinese vision is to connect China to Europe and it goes to the Middle East, you need Israel to cooperate with Jordan to put a train track. So it's not one on the expense of the other, at least for now. What we're seeing in the immediate region, China invests or gets involved in areas where there's an economic potential, or it serves these economic strategic, if you will. So they invested in the Suez Canal area. They bought the biggest port in Eastern Mediterranean, the port of Piraeus in Greece. They're investing in these large infrastructure projects. But part of the visions that Israelis are tinkering with is the potential reviving the old roads that went from Iraq to Haifa. And so that will require the Chinese to put in line Iraq, Jordan, and Israel to have this infrastructure. Again, this is more of a long-term vision, But there is actually a lot of potential for more regional cooperation through this involvement.
Very interesting. So a theme in the questions as they're coming in, and they're coming in by the dozens, really, really quickly. So I'm glad to see we have an engaged audience. Many are wondering, as I think I am too, about the risks and the benefits of countries allowing China that kind of access. So can you talk a little about why would a country like Israel allow its largest port or its airport or vital infrastructure to be controlled by a country with whom it doesn't really have a close connection? Add to that, and I see this too in questions, American debt to China, Israeli debt to China. There's a sort of looming fear, I think, that China will have a tremendous hold in the future over Israel and perhaps also over the United States.
I think, like in many countries, Israelis separated in their minds the security realm and the economic realm. In Israel, this is particularly strong because we were disconnected from our immediate neighborhood in terms of economics. So there was never an issue of Egyptians buying property in Israel. They may use it for something bad. So this is a new phenomenon. And in the last 15, 20 years, it was really treated from an economic perspective. And Israel is very proud that it's a startup nation and it draws foreign direct investment, including from China, and China is the future. In the last, maybe literally 2-3 years, partly under American pressure, there is a sense of unease, but it's not really quantified. The Chinese had bought a few food supply companies like Nuva, which is a huge Israeli company that is ideologically identified for decades with Israeli agriculture. It bought Adama, this is a company that does some natural resources.
Bought them outright? China completely owns Nuva?
Yes, it's amazing, huh?
That's unbelievable.
Now, also we should say this is not the Chinese government. These are Chinese corporations. But of course, we know in Chinese capitalism, the separation that we see in the West between state and company is closer maybe to models we saw in the 16th or 17th century with the East India Company in England. In other words, the role of the state and the role of free markets are not completely separated. So I've been to a few talks of security officials that you sense an unease about Chinese involvement, but they can't really put it in words. Okay, so they bought all of Israeli cottage cheese. So what? What are they going to do with all this cottage cheese? Haifa, therefore, is highlighted as that's a clear potential risk, at least for the Americans, to some extent. So there's this sense of unease, but difficulties in quantifying what exactly is the problem. And the Chinese are baffled by it because in their eyes, they're not a major investor. Israel is not an African country that they bought all the infrastructure and we are in huge debt to China. Israel occupies a very interesting place, whereas the Chinese invest, let's say, in Europe, mostly in high-tech, and in less developed countries, more in infrastructure. In Israel, we see both. So they're engaged in infrastructure and they invest in the high-tech sector.
Is there, that's fascinating. Is there concern about intellectual property rights?
To some extent, although just because I went to law school with the head of Israel's patent authority, and we used to walk once a week in Tel Aviv, so we had a lot of conversations about it. Reporting from the Israeli Patent Authority, their sense is actually that in the last few years, China is keeping more and more the rules of IP, partly because they have moved to becoming more of a developer and not just a copier. The only area that there's clear concern is security-related IP. As you may know, a lot of the Israeli high-tech companies in the security realm are former people from the Israeli security establishment. So for the first time, I saw some awareness of that in early 2020. How should we deal with that? We have this bureaucratic entity to constrain such investments. It had not been operating very seriously, to be honest, until now.
Great. I want to highlight another undergraduate fellow. As you know, Udi, these undergraduate fellows, and we have almost 24 of them this semester, work closely with our visiting guests from Israel and teach some of their own classes. So Amanda, are you around to ask a question?
You just have to unmute yourself, I think.
Hi, can you hear me?
Absolutely. Hi, Amanda.
Thank you. You touched a bit on the continued value of the U.S. as an ally for Israel. But as we currently witness the U.S. suffering at a time in which China continues to rise and become an increasingly valuable link for Israel economically, what do you think will continue to motivate and incentivize Israel's maintenance of relations with the U.S. beyond shared values and cultural ties?
So first of all, even in the economic reality, the United States remains Israel's top partner, more than China. And in this arena, the US has some advantages that for now China doesn't have, like capital markets. It's true that they're trying to launch like a NASDAQ in Shanghai and so on, but I think there's a deep belief in the economic elite that in terms of property rights and so on, the US is a better area to operate in. So I think in the economic arena, the US has some built-in advantages. Secondly, as I said earlier, Israel is the state of the Jewish people, and half of them live in the United States. And so Israel will always, no matter what happens, even if the US in 15 years is a third world developing country, Israel will be close to the US because half of our people live there. And thirdly, it will take a long time until Israeli elites who are very much leaning towards the US, Supreme Court, people went to school in the US, they think in terms of liberal values. It will take a long time for this to change.
Interesting. Although the skeptic in me wonders how you and I would have talked about Israel-Soviet relations in the 1950s. Yeah. When it was expected that every Israeli prime minister would attend a communist international every year, was taken for granted. And then one day you wake up and not only are relationships between Israel and the Soviet Union strained, but they're actually on opposite sides of the Cold War.
I think this is deeper.
I think that's right.
Within Zionism, there was tension between socialists like Ben-Gurion and the more left-leaning, and there was always, even in the 40s, I think even Ben-Gurion was closer to the West than he was to the Soviet Union. But you're right. We are both IR scholars. As you said, there's only interest. However, I think it's also what happens in the US. In the US, for now, Israel, it seems to me, is a domestic issue. It's not a strictly international issue. And so everyone talks about US's retreat from the region, but I don't think it's felt that strong in Israel. The alliance is as strong as it was, and Israel, to be very blunt, is as dependent as it was in the US.
Yes, certainly events in the last few days have demonstrated that the United States, at least in part, wants to play a role in the region. And you should have added, Udi, not only are we both IR scholars, we're also both live here in the US right now, so only further confirmation. You talked a little about other countries in the Middle East and their relationship with China, so can I flip that question on its head? This is of course a question coming from our audience about Israel's relationship with other countries who are neighbors to China. Is that causing any tension with China? Emily Gallo is one of the people who highlighted this question for me.
This is an excellent question. Israel, this is maybe a topic for another seminar, but Israel developed a very close alliance with India. Although we don't have official figures, according to some informal figures, billions of dollars flow from India essentially to Israeli defense industries. In the IDF Staff College, which I was its academic director last year, we have an Indian officer. There are very few foreign officers. One of them is Indian every year. So there is a close alliance. For now, from what I've seen, it has not been a huge issue for China. Again, I'm not an official. I don't know what goes in closed rooms. It is a future potential of tension. For now, it had not emerged as a huge issue. I think partly because India, which is supposed, it's potentially the pro-US balancer in Asia of China, because of the internal makings of India, we're not there yet. India is still not fully balancing China, but I think Emily is absolutely correct. This is a potential stumbling block in the future.
What is Israel's relationship with Taiwan and Japan? Is it in any way likely to provoke China?
So Israel, I think part of the deal of launching the diplomatic relations, again, it went from stages from 90 to 92. Part of them was downgrading in effect the relationship with Taiwan. We have an embassy-like, but it's called a trade mission. The relationship with Japan were never that close. They are slightly warmer than they were, but Japan is so reliant on oil from the Middle East that it was very careful to get too close to Israel.
Interesting. One very curious question from the audience has to do with Israel's, China's Jewish or Israeli expat population. Do you know much about the Jewish community in China and whether Israelis are moving to China now in order to work there, set up businesses there, raise their families there?
So there was a trickle of people arriving secretly in the 70s for defense industries. And then once relations opened in the 90s, there was an influx, not a huge community, but my younger brother actually from 1992 to 1994 did part of his undergraduates in a Chinese institution. That was very rare at the time, but I got a sense of this early Israeli community in Beijing. This was businessmen, a few diplomats. And there was a rumor which my brother floated. There was an Israeli carpenter for Tzfat who married a daughter of a leader in the Chinese Communist Party and was living in the Forbidden City. We're talking at like the mid-90s. And there are odd stories here and there. A friend of mine from high school married a Chinese woman, moved to a city called Qingdao, and essentially emigrated to China from the mid-90s. So this is a few hundred people. In my last visit to China, late in 2019, there was a sense that the Chinese, part of their more assertiveness, are slightly less hospitable to foreigners operating business-wise in China. And as you know, there was a history of Jewish communities that essentially disappeared by the late 19th century. These were traders who China was so big and so culturally influential that they disappeared. And there were 2-3 other waves, which if we have time, I can say a few more words about.
No, by all means, we have plenty of time. Also plenty of questions coming in, but plenty of time.
So we had this tiny community of traders, I think beginning in the 10th century. They survived for a few hundred years, but then disappeared. Some of their descendants are now returning back to Judaism. This is called the Kaifun community.
These were Jewish traders in China.
Yes, but by now they married into Chinese families, so they look completely Chinese. But some family names in this town are believed to be former Jews. And some of them are returning to Judaism with the encouragement of activists. The second wave was the 19th century. Again, Iraqi traders, mostly in Shanghai and Hong Kong. There's a recent book that came out this year about the 2 big families that were there, Kaduri and Sassoon. One of them, the Kaduris, made a huge donation to 2 educational institutions in mandatory Palestine. They founded the Kaduri boarding school, which was like the Exeter Academy or the Eton of the Yishuv. Yitzhak Rabin went there for high school. And in fact, the school was so good that based on his grades in Kaduri, he was accepted to UC Berkeley in 1940, but he decided not to go. And they still have some foothold, mostly in Hong Kong. Then we had this late 19th century, Russia got an extraterritorial portion of China to build a train rail. And to encourage ethnic Russians to move there, they made it very easy to Jews who were second-class citizens in Tsarist Russia to move there. This community survived on and off until the 50s. And we had, as I said, the grandfather of one of our prime ministers is buried there. The last wave of Jews came to Shanghai around the Second World War. These were people that flee the Nazis, many from Austria, actually. And some of them, as I said earlier, got involved with the Chinese Communist Party and became heroes of the revolution.
Very interesting. So now the flip side of this question, if this is about, you haven't answered the second part. I'd like more about this. So about Israelis moving to China to set up their lives there, set up businesses there. Are you seeing any trends? So a trickle in the 90s with this influx of Chinese money into high tech, which subsided in the last 2-3 years. There were some joint ventures. For example, some local governments in China made it very easy to Israeli companies to operate there and launch joint Chinese Israeli operations. But there's a structure there where there's a lot of enthusiasm at start. And then dealing with the bureaucracy, with the changes
a centralized economy that has centralized facets makes it somewhat more difficult. So I think a lot of hype, 2016, 2018, now subsiding a little bit.
Interesting. University exchange programs?
Yes, so the Technion opened a joint institution in China. Our university has some exchange programs. We in fact had
That's Haifa.
Yeah, the University of Haifa. We had a few postdocs from China, and the Israeli Council of Higher Education offers special scholarships for Chinese and Indian students. So we have in our English-speaking programs at the University of Haifa, we have every year a few Chinese, including people who come with fascinating stories. I had a student 2 years ago who was a Chinese lady officer in a peacekeeping, Chinese-keeping mission in Sudan, who came the following year to do a master's in Haifa. So again, we're learning each other. It's very different worlds, but there are instances like this.
Great, great. So while we're on the topic of Chinese visiting Israel, a question from the audience, as perhaps fewer Chinese scholars and students are coming to the US to study, or are being allowed into the US to study, or perhaps even are being pushed out, is Israel trying to attract scientists?
Yeah. So it's actually a topic of an op-ed I'm writing. There's clearly an opportunity here. I'm not sure it was fully seized, but it coincides well with trends in Israeli academia. Because of international rankings, universities are encouraged to offer programs in English. So our university, which is not Israel's top university, has 18 or 19 master's programs in English, most of them from the last few years. So almost by default, there'll be more opportunities of that. But and as I said, there are these scholarships, but it's not directly tied to the change in U.S. policy. But there is indeed an opportunity there. You're absolutely right.
Here's a question which you may not be able to answer, or you may be able to answer, but you can't answer us. Do you have a hunch as to whether or not Chinese employees who are working on sensitive projects in Israel, or who are visiting universities in Israel, whether there's any security concern about them? Are they being monitored? Is there any sense of suspicion or caution? Insofar as you know the answer, you might not be able to reveal it.
Yeah, let's say that in some circles, when people go to China, they are briefed about how to handle their environment there. But Chinese who come to Israel, I'm not aware of, I haven't been in Israel now for a year, but I haven't seen any huge suspicion. Partly Israel is just rearranging itself to understand what this issue is. So for example, the exact nature of the threat is not clear. A lot of the Chinese attacks or alleged Chinese attacks occur in the cyber realm, in which there is public information, and we know that many Israeli companies are engaged in that. But that's not direct suspicion against people, but just awareness of what's happening on the internet. Interesting.
Can you talk a little about both fossil fuels and renewable energy, and what Israel's and China's interests might be along those lines, in part because China is having trouble in the Spratly Islands obtaining more fuel? Is there perhaps a hope that access to the Middle East will alleviate some tensions?
I mean, China is already heavily tied into energy markets in the region. I think that there may be two issues in what you're raising. First of all, is there any Israeli innovation in terms of alternative energies that are relevant? This has been a long interest of China for at least 20 years. And as the Chinese ambassador who spoke to us at the Staff College last year said, Israelis are very good from moving to 0 to 1, and China is very good from moving from 1 to 1,000 or 1 million.
Scaling, so to speak. Yeah.
I don't know if he was pandering to us, but there's clearly interest in this area, along other areas. The actual access is already there, but massive. I don't know enough, to be honest, about internal usage in China of alternative energy. Israel is a leader, but it's not the leader. So it's clear an area they're interested in, but I'm not sure Israel has a huge advantage over Germany or other countries that are leading in these areas.
Does Israel have unique diplomatic relations with China? I assume there's an Israeli ambassador to China, and you said it has the second, did I understand correctly, Israel's
As far as I remember, I don't catch me on that. I think it's the second biggest embassy, and Israel intentionally or unintentionally copied the model it has in the United States, in which on top of an embassy, you have consulates. So these are lower level diplomatic missions.
Dispersed throughout China.
Yes. So we have in the US, I think 6 or 8. The closest one is in San Francisco. There's one in LA. Similarly, Israel has a somewhat similar number. Again, I don't remember the exact number, but it's spread throughout China. So in that respect, it is a bit special.
That's very interesting. To what extent do you think does China's human rights record make it complicated for Israeli governments to tighten their relationship with China?
So there's elements in civil society, of course, that's an issue for them. But perhaps because Israel is a small state or because of its history, it has been very pragmatic in dealing with other countries. And the state interest or interest of Jewish people abroad had superseded commitments to human rights. For example, Israel cooperated with the general's regime in the 70s in Argentina because there was a big Jewish community in Argentina, so went the argument. So I think here as well, I don't think Israelis are in feel that they're in a place to lecture China about human rights. This is a bit different in civil society where there is no more criticism.
Do you think, I'm slowly drawing to an end here because I think I have asked you in excess of 30 questions at a very rapid pace. I imagine you're exhausted. I assume that China has no interest in increasing the tensions that Israel is under in relationship to the US and avoiding a confrontation. Avoiding I'm not phrasing this well, avoiding a scenario in which it places Israel in an impossible choice between China and the US. So is China being, I guess my first part of the question is China being cautious and diplomatic in the way in which it manages this triangular relationship? That's the first part of my question. And the second part of my question is, can you imagine some sort of agreement or some sort of deal that China would offer Israel that Israel would simply be unable to refuse, and that would really lead to a crisis?
Like a deal with the horse in their bed or something? Or
yes, a deal you cannot refuse, an offer you cannot refuse. Yeah.
Yeah, so the Chinese response to the recent American pressures, in my own view, has been more assertive than at least I expected. So the Chinese ambassador, there was a change in ambassadors because one of them just died, wrote open letters to the Israeli public, as I referenced earlier. In some private conversations I was privy with from people from the university that serves the Communist Party in China, they were much more direct. They said the US is absolving its leadership. President Trump is not serious. How can you be aligned with the US? So they are pushing back, but we're not a major target from them. And I don't think it's such a huge concern to China. So tied to a broader picture of a more assertive China across the board. In terms of deal in the future, if we put it in the context of the United States, I don't think at this point China is in a position to offer anything comparable to what Israel has with the United States. However, in a future in which they're more dominant in the international system, they may have leading technologies, we may be in a different place, but we're not there yet.
So is that the answer to my second question? What you foresee sort of as a worst case crisis scenario in which Israel is put in a very difficult position in having to, say, reject a piece of military technology that China offers, or sell China a piece of military technology that the United States does not want Israel to sell?
So we had experience. We had two crises in 2000 and 2005. The US pushed very hard and Israel bowed down. The response from China was anger, a desire to stick to the letter of the contract, which meant huge fines, and a period in which Israel was put in the corner. Chinese senior officials didn't visit and so on, but that was when China was even less dominant. So I can see a potential crisis like this. It can happen, but China, as I said, is pragmatic. They won't break. I think they realize where we are. They're very good at measuring power. and my sense is it's closer perhaps to the way you're presenting it. They won't go all the way in placing Israel at the complete breakup of relationship.
And this, from a U.S. point of view, this China-Israel relationship fits into a United States plan to sort of remove itself from the Middle East because the region is becoming a tense place, a potential theater for a Chinese-U.S. showdown? Or does it actually make the United States more eager to reappear in the Middle East now that they realize that this vacuum that was left in the Middle East under Obama, somebody is going to come in and fill it, and if it's not the Chinese, it's the Russians?
Yeah, so for now, we have not seen a re-engagement of the US to the levels we've seen in the past. This space that you're referring to that they opened up, for example, Russian deployment in Syria since 2015, Russian direct involvement in fighting in Libya through the Wagner group. We haven't seen a US pushback. It's also, we should say, the Trump administration offers a strategy of sorts, but it was never concretized in any way or any policy document. So I think we'll have to wait for, if we have another administration, they'll have to offer some strategy. Israel is somewhat different in that respect because, as I said, it's not simply a power politic alliance, but it's a domestic item on the US agenda. So for now, the space that opened did not suck the US back in, or at least the US chose not to be sucked back in, but Israel is in a way a special category.
Fantastic. I think that's a great note to end on. Udi, this was like drinking from a fire hydrant. Tremendous amount of information. I've lost count at some point how many questions we managed to do in just about 1 hour. So first of all, I would like to thank you, Professor Udi Eiran, for joining us in the very first conversation about Israel and the great powers. In this case, focusing on China, and I hope everybody in the background is clapping vigorously. I wanted to thank all our attending guests, and a special thank you to our undergraduate fellows, Maya Rosen and Amanda Cash, who joined in to ask questions live. Great big thank you to the Institute staff who made this a amazingly seamless event. At least I hope it looked seamless from the other end, and who worked very, very, very hard in the last few weeks to make this evening possible. And lastly, I want to thank you, community members and the various foundations who make programs like this evening's program possible through their generous support. I would like to encourage all of you to please visit our Institute website. We are the Berkeley Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies. To learn about upcoming events, I'll mention 2 events, one in the future, one in the recent past. On November 18, we will be hosting David Horvitz, the founding editor of the Times of Israel, to talk to us about diaspora-Israel relations and about the US presidential elections. You'll notice, once again, Udi, that we got the timing on this right perfectly. And if by some chance you missed a recent live performance, which we featured live from Jerusalem, we had the Katamon dance group perform on our behalf. It's called Meet Me in the Market, and you can find a recording of that, as well as a host of podcasts and conversations on our website of the Berkeley Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies. With that, I thank you again, Udi, and I thank the audience, and I wish you all a good night and a wonderful rest of the week, and Shana Tova.
Thank you very much. Shana Tova.